Now in that time we got along pretty tolerable, renting ground and paying high rents. And this time I had 2 sons, and I soon found that I was better at increasing my family than my fortune. So I figured it better to hunt out some other place to get along, and with the help of my father-in-law, we packed up all our plunder and headed out towards the middle part of Tennessee, first settling along Mulberry Fork, and then to Beans Creek. But in that time, I not only found that wildlife was in abundance, especially bear, which has always been my favorite to hunt, but I found that there was another particular critter that was in abundance as well. One that if you don't watch it, will cause you nothing but grief and misery for nigh about 18, 20 years or so, and that's a child. Because in that time, moving from Mulberry Fork to Beans Creek, my wife and I had our 3rd child, a little girl who we named Marjorie. So now I figure between the abundance of bears and babies, I'm all set up in the world and I need nothing else. But I soon found that this was all a mistake, because in 1813, the Red Sticks, the hostile faction of the Creek Nation down there in the Mississippi Territory, the news come back to us that they got together and they boxed up about 400 men, women, and children at Fort Mims and massacred every last one of them. When I heard this, my dander was up, and I knowed only war to put it right again, so I told Polly I was off to join the fighting. She shed a heap of tears and begged me not to go. But says I that if every man was willing to wait for his wife to be ready for him to go to war, while we get no fighting done and all be burnt and scalped up in our cabins. So I packed up my plunder and made on my way to Winchester with the rest of the volunteers. From there we made our way down to the Mississippi Territory. And at Beatty Springs, Jackson divided our forces and told us one very simple command: seek and destroy. Well, the seeking part was easy, because we had no idea where they were at, so we just kept on wandering about blindly for the most part, until finally things got so bad and our supplies started giving out that each and every one of us was getting ready to give up the ghost. And things got to the point to where we had nary to eat but parched corn and water for about 3 weeks on end. Well, finally, when each one of us was getting ready to say our last rites and go on to meet the Maker, well, Providence intervened in the form of 2 Cherokee scouts who told us that just about 2 days riding from here, there's a little creek village called Taloosahatchee. Well, we figured this is what we're here for. Let's mount up and get some riding done, because we're going to go fight and we're going to go avenge what happened at Fort Mims. So when we got there, we come up with a battle plan. And in the pre-dawn hours of November 3rd, 1813, we formed our lines around the villages. And then, just from the center of our formation, they sent out an advance guard in order to try and lure the Creeks out of the safety of their village. And it worked, because when them Creeks seen us, they took off hollering like devils out of hell, letting off with their bows and arrows and their muskets. And soon enough, when they come within reach of us, we give them return fire. And they soon found that they were our property, and there was nothing for it but to retreat to the safety of the village. But as we made our way inwards, I'll never forget to this day, off to my right I counted upwards of 46 warriors running into the safety of this one cabin, which in front of it sat this little old squaw there with a bow and arrow across her lap. And when we got closer, she notched up that arrow to the bow and she drew back and let it fly and killed one of our lieutenants. And this sight so enraged us all that we fired upon the old woman. Before she hit the ground, she had about 20 balls plumb through her. And then we commenced to set the cabins on fire. We could hear them in there screaming for their gods. They wanted to surrender, but their pride just wouldn't allow it. Matter of fact, just close to the flames was this little old Creek boy who was trying to escape, but he couldn't because one of his arms and legs was shattered by musket balls. And I watched as the grease stewed out of him like fat out of a beaver's tail. Now the next morning, we had heard that there was a fine chance of taters to be found in the cellars underneath what we'd burned up the day before. And seeing as how we was all starved as wolves, we took to digging, and sure enough, when we found them taters, we ate till we nearly burst. I wish I could say I'd rather not, because although they looked like they'd been stewed with fat meat, they'd been cooked by the grease that ran off them engines we burned up the day before. Now, the next battle I took part of was the Battle of Talladega. Weren't too much to note about that, except for the fact of the matter that my next door neighbor, James Patton, well, he was grievously wounded. And 2 days after the fighting was over with, he passed on and we had to bury him. And when I made my way back home after my first term of enlistment, I informed his wife Elizabeth that he was gone. But mind you, after the Battle of Talladega, I myself as well as others, we was ready to make our way back home. But Jackson wasn't going to have none of it. I tell you, old Hickory, he runs a tight ship. And in fact, when some of them tried to plan a mutiny by riding out of the camp, he placed a cannon and some men with rifles at the bridge crossing over so we couldn't get out. Well, we stayed on until finally we had some reinforcements come to relieve us. And then we went on back home, gifted the sum of $65.59 for all of our services. And when I got back home, I tried to settle back into the ease of family life, but it wasn't going to last too long, you see, because not only did I miss out on Jackson's decisive victory against the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, but I also missed out on some of the British fighting. However, I was told there still might be some left available for me, and I wanted a taste of the British fighting, so I signed up again, and we headed on back down to the Mississippi Territory until we started making our way into the Florida Territory. And there, when we got to this one place called the Cutoff Run, we had to leave our horses behind because the swamps made it impassable and we had to go on foot. Well, folks, when I got there, I wish I maybe shot, but there wasn't so much as a red coat or a red thread on the grass to shoot at. And we spent the rest of our second term of enlistment just cleaning up the backwash of war. Finally, we had a belly full of it and we made our way back up home. And in that time, after I got home, I was mighty pleased up, because that ended my career as a warrior, and I'm mighty glad of it. I felt that if I kept fooling about in war this way, I might have got used to it and possibly used up at it. But despite all the things, starvation, privations, and the danger of the Creeks that I had faced in my time of the war, it had not prepared me for what was to happen next. For in March of 1815, my beloved wife Polly took ill and rapidly passed on. And that left me with 3 young'uns that needed a mother. Just so happened, that Elizabeth lady I told y'all about, well, she had 2 kids that needed a father. So I got to thinking about it, started paying courtship to her, and in a very brief time, we went ahead and tied the knot. But in that time, not too long after we tied the knot, I decided I was going to go explore new territory for us to settle down on. Wherein that was a big mistake, possibly one of the worst of my life, because I about nearly lost my life due to a malaria episode. But fortunately, through the kindness of some Choctaws, as well as some of the settlers in the back country, they nursed me back to health and I made my way back home to Tennessee. Whereupon I wish I may be shot, but my companions who had been with me, when they went back home, they passed by the house of Elizabeth, and they told her that I had already passed on. So you could imagine she looked like she'd seen a ghost when I come back through the front door, and she said, "We heard you was dead." Well, I know this was a whopper of a lie as soon as I heard it. I said, "I'm standing right here." But from that point on, we made our way out to Lawrence County. But just before we done so, I was elected Lieutenant Colonel of the local militia, and from there I was elected as one of the county commissioners, helping to establish the boundaries of Lawrence County as well as the county seat. And apparently, they thought me, for whatever reason, fit for the job, but I was elected to be the local magistrate. Now at the time, we had so few folks in the backwoods, and we was all spread out, that this was a pretty easy job for me, because if I wanted to serve out a warrant on a fella, I'd just tell one of my deputies, "You go fetch him up and you bring him back for trial." But the more folks that started coming into that countryside, well, now everybody's wanting documentation. They're wanting me to write and sign out the warrants. And for a man with such a limited education, this was a mighty hard business on me, for I could barely write my own name, much less the warrants attached to it, and it was about near a huckleberry above my persimmon. But apparently I must have done a decent enough job, because when I was announcing to friends and constituents in that region that I was going to run for Tennessee State Legislature, well, they elected me, and I served 2 terms for them as faithfully as I could. But like many things that I've faced in life, there was hardships attached, because I had no more served than 14 days in my first term of legislature when I found out from the folks back home that my grist mill and my powder mill had been washed out in a flood by Shoal Creek, which rendered my distillery useless, because if I can't grind up the corn to make the mash, what good is that? We can't make no whiskey. So I went ahead and paid up as long as I had a bit's worth in the world and scuffled for more, which led us moving further and further out west in Tennessee. And in that time, when we got out there, I finished up my last term of the Tennessee State Legislature, and I entered into a boat stay building business. Me and a few friends of mine, we got together, and for months we went out there and cut down the trees and sawed them into planks to ship down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and they would use them to make boats in turn. But when we got all our staves ready and enlisted the aid of 2 flatboats, well, we found this was going to be a mighty big mistake, because Captain Jonah, it was his first solo voyage, and he had no idea how in the world to steer that boat proper, much less how to banker at the end of the day. So when I found this out, I was mighty miffed at him, and I went ahead and hit him with a real sock dogger right over the top of the head. And all that was left of him was a little bit of a grease spot on the deck of that there boat. But we lashed our boats together for safety reasons, but we couldn't find ourselves with the strength and the means to go ahead and pull off over onto the bank for the night. And despite what the riverboat men were doing, flashing their lanterns and telling us how to get on over to shore safely, we had to keep on going throughout the night. Finally, come morning, I was relieved from the rudder, and I went down below deck to rest my eyes. But I'd no more sooner than started to doze off, and I heard this great big sound that almost sounded like the skies had been rent open. And I feared for this, because I thought, Lord have mercy, on a sinner like me, I ain't going to make it to the afterlife. Well, what happened was we run aground on a sawyer that had ripped out the bottom of the boat, and the boat started flooding so much so that it started capsizing. And all my friends took off to jumping off the boat, save about 2 of them, until finally, through great exertions, I was able to get my hands up through this porthole here and let them know that someone else was down below deck. And they grabbed a hold of me and started pulling and pulling. The problem was that hole wasn't hardly big enough for me. But that didn't matter. I said, boys, you got to get me out of here. And so they did. But I was a trifle embarrassed after they did, because when they did, they jerked me through that hole and they skinned my clothes off, clean as taking the skin off a rabbit. And so here I was, naked as the day I was born, having to jump in the Mississippi and swim to safety. And in such a same state, when we made our way to to Memphis, we met up with Major Marcus Winchester, who ended up endorsing me for my first run to Congress. And he did so after seeing that I was naked. I don't understand that. But nonetheless, he's a good fella, and I do appreciate his support. And I tell you, I needed it. Because in many, many cases, whether it was the legislature or running for Congress, I wound up being outclassed by many of my opponents. In fact, there was one while I was running for Tennessee State Legislature, Dr. Butler, who was a nephew of Andrew Jackson. And he would always get up first and speak all day long, leaving me hardly a chance to get a word in edgewise. But I wasn't going to take this lying down, you see, because I come up with a plan. At that time, what we was doing along the campaign trail was traveling together. And every place we go, we'd stop off and stay the night, and every place we go to speak on the stumps, we do the same all together. And I got to the point of where I started being able to memorize his speech, and finally I committed the whole doggone thing to memory. And one day I humbly got up there to Dr. Butler, and I says, look at me. Does it look like I have much to say about the state of politics in this neck of the woods? You've been going up there and speaking first all day long and hardly giving me a chance to get a word in edgewise to these fine folks. Do you mind if I just get up there and talk first for a change? It won't take no more than a few minutes. And he scratches on his chin there for a moment and thinks, well, yeah, that'll be all right. When I got up there, I rattled off Dr. Butler's speech and left that fellow scrambling for something to say. But I have to admit, it must have worked in some way somehow, because I was elected to 3 terms in Congress. The most notable of which was when, in 1830, I opposed Andrew Jackson's Indian removal bill. And for those of you who may not have heard of this piece of information, well, it's as simple as this. It proposed to remove the civilized tribes from the eastern states to west of the Mississippi, to lands that they were not familiar with. Well, I sure for one couldn't stand for that. When I looked over this bill, I stood up on the floor of Congress and I spoke out again. I said, Mr. Speaker, fellow members of the Congress of these United States, I've stood before you a good many times in fights and fun. And we've had a laugh or two for the good of the country and our own digestion. But now you can fold up your grins and put them away, or you'll hear no jokes from David Crockett today. You have something here before you called an engine bill. I don't aim to keep you here much longer arguing about it. You've had enough of that already. But before it comes to a vote, I just want to remind you of something. Expansion is a mighty fine thing. Sure, we got to grow, but not at the expense of the things this nation was founded to protect. You wouldn't be doing the settlers no favors voting for this bill. You'd only be making rich men out of land grabbers and speculators. And they're a no-count lot about as natural as flies around a molasses barrel. This here godforsaken bill is little more than a matter of the head and not the heart. And my head is telling me that I cannot go nor follow there. And in fact, if I'm the only man in the whole of my district, much less this nation, to vote against this unjust measure, I will gladly do so. And I believe it is a choice that will not make me ashamed to stand before the throne of judgment at the end of my days. Well, unfortunately, despite all that fine speaking, it passed.